The barbed wire tore through Elena's flesh like vengeful claws as she squeezed through the gap she'd spent 3 weeks widening with stolen nails and determination born of desperation. Behind her, the Chinese labor camp slept fitfully in the pre-dawn darkness of 1882, its wooden barracks housing hundreds of souls trapped in a system that promised freedom but delivered only chains forged from debt and deceit. Her legs, already weakened from months of malnutrition and back-breaking work on the Central Pacific Railroad, gave way as she stumbled down the rocky hillside. The taste of copper filled her mouth as she bit her tongue to keep from crying out. Every step sent fire through her bruised ribs, every breath a reminder of the overseer's boot from yesterday's discipline session. But she kept moving, driven by a singular thought that had sustained her through the darkest nights. I will not die here. The moon hung like a silver coin against the Nevada sky, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for her with grasping fingers. She had stolen what little food she could carry, a handful of rice, some dried meat that tasted more like leather than sustenance, but it was already gone, consumed during her first night of freedom. Now 3 days later, she was nothing more than a ghost wandering the vast emptiness of the American West, her bare feet leaving bloody prints on the unforgiving earth. The fever came with the fourth sunrise, sending shivers through her emaciated frame despite the desert heat. Her vision blurred, transforming the sagebrush into writhing serpents, and the distant mountains into the faces of everyone she'd lost. Her mother, who had sold her to pay a debt, her sister, who had promised to find her but never came, the children she'd helped care for in the camp, their eyes holding the same hopeless resignation she'd fought so hard to resist. As the sun reached its merciless zenith, Elena's legs finally betrayed her completely. She collapsed beside a dried creek bed, her body too weak to continue the charade of strength. The silence of the desert was absolute, broken only by the sound of her labored breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. She closed her eyes and waited for the end, wondering if anyone would ever know she had tried to live. Chapter 2. The Guardian. Thomas Hartwell had not spoken a word in 3 years, 2 months and 16 days. Not since the morning he'd returned home from checking his cattle to find his wife Sarah and their infant daughter lying still in their bed, claimed by the fever that had swept through the territory like a prairie fire. The words had simply stopped. What use were they when the only voices he'd wanted to hear would never answer back? He lived now in a world of profound silence, communicating with the occasional trader or drifter through gestures and written notes. His cabin, nestled in a valley between 2 mesas, had become a sanctuary where grief lived alongside a stubborn refusal to surrender to despair. He tended his small herd, maintained his garden, and carved wooden toys that no child would ever play with, each one a prayer to a heaven that felt impossibly distant. It was his horse, Stryker, who first noticed the still form beside the creek. The animal's nervous whinnying broke through Thomas's reverie as he rode the boundary of his property, checking the few remaining cattle that were all that stood between him and destitution. At first, he thought it might be a wounded animal, but as he drew closer, his heart constricted with recognition. A woman, young, Chinese, her black hair matted with blood and dirt. Her clothes were little more than rags, and her exposed arms and legs bore the unmistakable marks of violence. But it was her face that stopped him cold. Even unconscious, even ravaged by suffering, there was something in her features that spoke of unbroken spirit, of a will that had carried her farther than her body should have been able to go. Without hesitation, Thomas dismounted and gathered her into his arms. She weighed no more than a child, her bones sharp against his chest. He could feel the fever burning through her skin, could see the shallow rise and fall of her chest that spoke of a life hanging by the thinnest of threads. As he carried her toward his cabin, he found himself whispering a prayer, the first words he'd attempted in years, though they came out as nothing more than a breathless rasp. "Hold on," he managed to say, his voice foreign to his own ears. "Just hold on." Chapter 3. The Awakening. Elena's return to consciousness was gradual, like swimming up from the depths of a black lake. First came the sensation of warmth, not the brutal heat of the desert sun, but the gentle warmth of wool blankets and a crackling fire. Then came the scent of pine logs, and something else, something that made her stomach clench with hunger so profound it was almost painful. Soup. Her eyes opened to reveal rough-hewn wooden walls painted golden by firelight. She was lying in a real bed, the first she'd experienced in over a year, with clean sheets that smelled of sage and soap. A small table beside her held a steaming bowl and a wooden spoon, and next to that a cup of water so clear it seemed like a miracle. "You're awake." The voice was soft, rough with disuse, and she turned toward it to see a man sitting in a chair beside the fireplace. He was tall, even-seated, with brown hair that needed cutting, and eyes the color of winter sky. His clothes were clean but worn, and his hands, she noticed his hands particularly, were scarred and calloused, but gentle as they rested on his knees. Elena tried to speak, but only a croak emerged. The man, Thomas, she would learn, immediately rose and brought her the water. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if he were afraid she might disappear like smoke if he moved too quickly. "Easy," he said, supporting her head as she drank. "You've been fevered for 2 days. Your body needs time. 2 days." The concept seemed impossible. In the camp, 2 days of rest would have meant death, if not from the overseer's punishment, then from the hopelessness that crept into idle minds. Yet here she was, alive, cared for by a stranger who asked nothing in return. "Why?" she whispered, the word barely audible. Thomas's expression grew distant, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice carried the weight of accumulated sorrow. "Because someone should have been there for them," he said simply. "Because mercy is the only thing that makes us human." Chapter 4. The Healing. The next weeks passed in a rhythm Elena had never known, one of gentle routine and gradual healing. Thomas cared for her with the devotion of a man who had lost the chance to care for anyone else. He changed her bandages with hands that barely trembled, prepared meals that slowly restored her strength, and never once asked about her past or pressed her for details she wasn't ready to share. She learned about him in fragments, pieced together from the few words he spoke and the evidence of his life. The feminine touches throughout the cabin, lace curtains yellow with age, a woman's shawl draped over a chair, a small pair of shoes on a shelf, spoke of love and loss. The way he sometimes paused in his work to stare at nothing, his hands stilling on whatever task occupied them, told her that his silence was born of grief too deep for words. As her strength returned, Elena began to help with small tasks. She mended his clothes with surprising skill, her fingers remembering the needlework her mother had taught her before everything went wrong. She tended his garden, coaxing life from the stubborn desert soil with a patience that spoke of hard-won wisdom. And slowly, carefully, she began to share her own story. "I came to America with dreams," she told him one evening, as they sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea he'd made from wild mint. "My family sold everything to pay for my passage. I was supposed to work for 2 years to pay back the debt, then I would be free to build a life." Thomas listened without judgment as she spoke of the ship that had brought her across the Pacific, crammed with other hopeful souls who had no idea what awaited them. Of the man who met her at the dock in San Francisco, speaking of opportunity and prosperity, while the chains of indentured servitude closed around her. Of the months that followed, the back-breaking labor, the violence, the systematic destruction of hope. "I thought I would die there," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that traced silver paths down her cheeks. "But then I realized that dying there would mean they had won, that my family's sacrifice meant nothing. So I chose to live, even if it killed me." Thomas reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His touch was warm, solid, real in a way that made her heart stumble. "You're safe now," he said, and she heard the promise in his voice. "No one will hurt you here." Chapter 5. The Blooming. Spring came early to the valley that year, painting the desert in shades of green that seemed impossible after the harsh winter. Elena had been with Thomas for 3 months, and the changes in both of them were as remarkable as the transformation of the landscape. Thomas had begun to speak more, his voice growing stronger with each passing day. He told her about his life before the silence, his childhood on a farm in Missouri, his journey west with dreams of cattle ranching, his marriage to Sarah, a school teacher who had seen something in the quiet cowboy that others missed. "She used to say I was like a book written in a language only she could read," he said one morning as they worked together in the garden. "When she died, I thought all the words had died with her." Elena looked up from the seedling she was transplanting, dirt smudged on her cheek and sunshine in her hair. "Maybe they were just waiting for the right reader," she said softly. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility, and the kind of tension that comes when two wounded souls recognize something precious in each other. Thomas reached out and gently brushed the dirt from her face, his touch lingering longer than necessary. "Elena," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as she felt something inside her chest bloom like the wild flowers that dotted the valley floor. When she opened them again, she saw her own wonder reflected in his gaze. "I never thought I could feel this way again," she whispered. "Neither did I," he replied, and then he was kissing her, soft and reverent, and full of promises neither of them dared speak aloud. Their happiness was a fragile thing, beautiful and bright, and constantly threatened by the reality of their circumstances. Elena was, technically, still the property of the Chinese labor camp. The mark branded on her wrist, a symbol of ownership that made her stomach turn, was a constant reminder that her freedom was stolen, not given. Thomas knew this, just as he knew that every day she stayed with him was a day of borrowed time. He had seen the bounty notices in town, the crude drawings of Chinese workers who had escaped their bonds. The reward for Elena's return was $50, a fortune to men who had little and cared less about the humanity of their quarry. They spoke of leaving, of traveling further west or north to territories where the reach of the railroad companies was lighter. But Thomas's cattle were his only source of income, and selling them would take time they might not have. Elena suggested she could work in town, perhaps as a seamstress or cleaning woman, but they both knew that a Chinese woman traveling alone would attract attention they couldn't afford. The solution came from an unexpected source. Father Miguel, the elderly priest who served the small chapel in the nearest town, had been a frequent visitor to the cabin since Elena's arrival. He had taken to her immediately, charmed by her intelligence and moved by her story. More importantly, he had connections throughout the territory, connections that might prove invaluable. "I have a proposition," he said one evening over dinner, his weathered hands folded on the table before him. "There is a family in California, the Kowalskis, who have been looking for a woman to help with their children and their household. They are good people, Catholics, who would ask no questions about your past." Elena's heart sank. "You want me to leave?" "I want you to be free," the priest corrected gently. "Truly free, not just hiding. They would provide you with papers, a new identity. You could start fresh." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed the implications. Finally he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "What about us?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like smoke. Father Miguel's expression was kind but firm. "Sometimes love means letting go, my son. Sometimes it means choosing the beloved's safety over our own happiness." Chapter 7. The Choice. The debate that followed was the first real argument Elena and Thomas had ever had, and it raged for days with the intensity of a summer storm. Elena refused to leave, insisting that she would rather face capture than abandon the only true happiness she had ever known. Thomas, driven by love and desperation, argued that her safety was more important than his selfish desires. "You don't understand," Elena said, her voice breaking with the force of her emotions. "I've been owned by others my entire life, first by my parents, who sold me to settle their debts, then by the labor contractors who bought me like livestock. I will not be owned by your fear, Thomas. I will not let you make this choice for me, and I will not watch you die for my sake," Thomas replied, his own voice cracking. "I've lost everyone I've ever loved. I can't lose you too, especially not when I have the power to keep you safe." The stalemate might have continued indefinitely, if not for the arrival of 3 riders on a Tuesday morning in early summer. Elena saw them first, their dark shapes silhouetted against the dawn sky as they crested the ridge overlooking the valley. She knew immediately who they were, the set of their shoulders, the way they moved with predatory purpose, the glint of metal at their hips. "Bounty hunters," she whispered, the words like ice in her veins. Thomas followed her gaze and immediately began making preparations. He loaded his rifle, checked the ammunition for his pistol, and instructed Elena to hide in the root cellar beneath the cabin. But she refused, standing her ground with a determination that was both admirable and terrifying. "If I'm going to die, I'll die fighting," she said, her chin raised in defiance. "I won't cower in a hole like a rabbit." The men approached slowly, their horses picking their way carefully down the hillside. Elena could see them clearly now, 3 hard-faced men in dusty clothes, their eyes cold and calculating. The leader, a man with graying hair and scars that spoke of a violent life, called out when they were still 50 yards away. "Morning, friend," he said, his voice carrying false cheer. "We're looking for some lost property." Chinese girl, about 20, answers to the name of Elena. "You seen anyone like that around here?" Thomas stepped forward, his rifle held casually but ready. "Just me and my wife here," he said, his voice steady despite the lie. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description." The bounty hunter's eyes narrowed as he studied the cabin, taking in the garden, the well-maintained fence, the small details that spoke of a woman's presence. "Funny thing," he said, dismounting from his horse. "We got word from a trader that he saw a Chinese woman working in this garden just last week. Real specific description, too." Eliza felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she stepped out from behind Thomas, her head held high. "There's no need for lies," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am Elena. I am the one you seek." Chapter 8. The Confrontation. The next few minutes unfolded with the terrible clarity of a nightmare. The bounty hunters spread out, their hands moving to their weapons as they prepared to take their prize. Thomas raised his rifle, but Elena placed a gentle hand on the barrel, lowering it. "No," she said softly. "No more violence. Not for me." The lead bounty hunter laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Smart girl. You come along quiet-like, and nobody has to get hurt." But Elena had no intention of going quietly. As the men approached, she began to speak, her voice carrying across the valley with the power of absolute truth. "My name is Elena Zhang," she said, her words ringing like a bell. "I am the daughter of a rice farmer who sold me to pay his debts. I am the sister of a girl who promised to find me and never came. I am the woman who survived a year of slavery, who escaped through barbed wire and desert heat, who found love in the arms of a man who taught me that mercy makes us human." The bounty hunters paused, something in her tone giving them pause. Behind them, Elena saw Father Miguel approaching on his old mule, drawn by some instinct that help was needed. I am also, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger, a woman who will not be owned. Not by debt, not by law, not by fear. If you take me, you will have to drag me every step of the way. You will have to bind me, gag me, and watch me every moment, because I will never stop trying to escape. I will never stop fighting, and when you finally deliver me to my captors, I will tell everyone I meet about the 3 cowards who made their living hunting human beings like animals. The effect of her words was immediate and profound. The youngest of the 3 bounty hunters, barely more than a boy, actually took a step backward, his face pale. The second man, older and more hardened, seemed to waver, his hand falling away from his gun. But the leader was made of different stuff. His face darkened with rage, and he drew his pistol, pointing it directly at Elena's heart. Enough talk, he snarled. You're coming with us, dead or alive. The reward's the same either way. Chapter 9. The Sacrifice. What happened next would be debated for years afterward by the few witnesses who remained. Thomas, seeing the gun pointed at the woman he loved, made a decision that spoke to the very core of his being. He stepped forward, placing himself between Elena and the weapon, his arms spread wide. If you want her, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, you'll have to go through me. The bounty hunter's face twisted with contempt. Gladly, he said, and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the valley like thunder, but the bullet never found its mark. Father Miguel, arriving at the critical moment, had fired his own weapon, an ancient shotgun that had belonged to his grandfather, striking the bounty hunter's arm and spoiling his aim. In the chaos that followed, Thomas tackled the wounded man while Elena grabbed the fallen pistol. The other 2 bounty hunters, faced with the sudden reversal of fortune, chose discretion over valor, and spurred their horses into retreat, leaving their leader behind. As the dust settled, Elena found herself standing over the defeated bounty hunter, the pistol heavy in her hands. For a moment, she felt the weight of all the violence that had been done to her, all the injustices she had endured. It would be so easy to pull the trigger, to end this threat forever. But then she looked at Thomas, saw the love and concern in his eyes, and remembered the man who had taught her that mercy was what made them human. Slowly, she lowered the weapon. Get out, she said to the bounty hunter, who was clutching his wounded arm. Get out and don't come back. Tell your employers that Elena Zhang is dead. Tell them you found her body by the creek, or that she fell from a cliff, or that she was taken by wolves. Tell them whatever you want, but never speak my name again. The man looked at her with a mixture of pain and grudging respect. You could have killed me, he said. Yes, Elena replied simply, but I chose not to. That's what makes me free. Chapter 10. The New Beginning. The bounty hunter left, cradling his wounded arm and leading his horse on foot. They never saw him again. Though word eventually reached them that Elena Zhang had indeed been reported dead, her body supposedly found in a canyon miles from Thomas's cabin. In the weeks that followed, Elena and Thomas began to plan their future with a freedom they had never dared imagine. Father Miguel, it turned out, had more than just a connection to the Kowalski family in California. He had a network of allies throughout the West who helped people disappear when necessary. Within a month, Elena had new papers identifying her as Elena Hartwell, wife of Thomas Hartwell, born in San Francisco to parents who had died in a tragic fire. They were married in a ceremony that took place in the small chapel at sunset, with Father Miguel officiating and the desert wind serving as their choir. Elena wore a dress that had belonged to Thomas's first wife, altered to fit her smaller frame, and Thomas wore his father's wedding ring, passed down through generations of Hartwell men. Do you, Thomas, take Elena to be your wife in sickness and in health, in joy and in sorrow, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Thomas said, his voice strong and sure. And do you, Elena, take Thomas to be your husband, to love and to cherish in freedom and in bondage, for as long as you both shall live? Elena's voice caught on the word bondage, but she continued with fierce determination. I do, I choose to, I choose him, and I choose freedom, and I choose love over fear, now and always. The kiss they shared as husband and wife tasted of tears and hope in the wild mint that grew beside the creek. In the distance, the sun painted the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the future stretched before them like an unwritten song. Chapter 11. The Revelation. 5 years passed before the truth of Elena's escape became fully clear, and when it did, it came in the form of a letter delivered by a Chinese merchant who had traveled the railroad lines gathering stories of those who had disappeared. Elena, now the mother of 2 children, Sarah, named for Thomas's first wife, and Miguel, named for the priest who had saved them, read the letter with growing amazement. It was from her sister, Li Wei, who had indeed been searching for her all these years. My beloved sister, the letter began. I have learned that you are alive, and my heart sings with joy. I have news that will change everything you thought you knew about your escape. What followed was a revelation that transformed Elena's understanding of her own story. The gap in the fence that she had thought she had created through weeks of patient work had actually been made by someone else, someone who had been watching the camp, waiting for the right moment to help. The food she had thought she had stolen had been placed where she could find it, and the path she had followed through the desert had been marked with subtle signs that had guided her toward safety. There is a network, Li Wei wrote, of people who have dedicated their lives to helping those in bondage find freedom. They call themselves the Silent Railroad, and they have been operating for years throughout the West. The merchant who told me your story also told me of a man who has been helping Chinese workers escape, a man who lost his own family and found purpose in saving others. Elena looked up from the letter to find Thomas watching her, his expression carefully neutral. You knew, she said, the words barely a whisper. Thomas nodded slowly. I've been helping people escape for 3 years. Ever since Sarah and the baby died, I needed something to give my life meaning. When I found you by the creek, it wasn't an accident. I had been watching the camp, waiting for the right moment to help someone get away, but you never expected to fall in love with the woman you were trying to save. Elena finished. No, Thomas said, his voice soft with wonder. I never expected to be saved by her. Chapter 12, The Truth Revealed. The full scope of Thomas's activities became clear over the following days. The cabin that Elena had thought was his simple home was actually a station on the Silent Railroad, equipped with hidden compartments and secret passages. The network of contacts that Father Miguel had mentioned was real and extensive, stretching from the labor camps of Nevada to the free territories of Oregon and beyond. Thomas had been responsible for the successful escape of dozens of Chinese workers, providing them with supplies, guidance, and new identities. He had used his grief as a cover, playing the role of a broken man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, while secretly orchestrating one of the most effective rescue operations in the American West. But why didn't you tell me? Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. Because I fell in love with you, Thomas said simply, and love made me selfish. I wanted to keep you here, to build a life with you, instead of helping you move on to safety like I had with the others. I convinced myself that I was protecting you, but really I was protecting myself from another loss. Elena was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. Then, to Thomas's surprise, she began to laugh. Not with humor, but with the joy of perfect understanding. Don't you see, she said, taking his hands in hers. We saved each other. You gave me freedom, and I gave you purpose. You gave me safety, and I gave you love. We were both broken, and together we became whole. Epilogue. The message. 20 years later, Elena Hartwell stood on the porch of her home, watching her children play in the garden that had become legendary throughout the territory. Sarah, now 25 and a teacher like Thomas's first wife, was visiting with her own children. Miguel, 23 and a doctor, had just returned from the East Coast where he had been studying advanced medical techniques. The Silent Railroad had evolved over the years, eventually becoming part of the larger movement to end forced labor in the American West. Elena and Thomas had continued their work, helping hundreds of people find freedom, and their home had become a symbol of hope for the oppressed. A new letter had arrived that morning, this one from a young woman in California who had heard their story and wanted to know how they had found the courage to choose love over fear. Elena sat down at her desk, picked up her pen, and began to write. My dear friend, you ask me how we found the courage to love in the face of such darkness. The answer is simple. We didn't find it, we created it. Love is not something that happens to us, it is something we choose, again and again, in spite of everything that tries to destroy it. I was a slave who became free. Thomas was a broken man who became whole. Together, we learned that love is not just an emotion, it is an act of rebellion against a world that tries to convince us we are not worthy of happiness. Every day we choose to love each other is a victory against those who would reduce us to property, to grief, to the sum of our suffering. The West is a hard place, full of hard people who do hard things. But it is also a place where two wounded souls can find each other across the vastness of the desert and choose to build something beautiful together. Love transcends all boundaries, of race, of class, of past trauma, of present fear. It transcends the wire fences, and the branded marks, and the bounty hunters, and the men who think they own us. Love is the only force in the universe that makes us truly free. Not the law, not money, not even rescue, only love. And the most beautiful thing about love is that it multiplies when shared. The love Thomas and I found together became the love we shared with our children, and the love we shared with everyone who came to our door seeking freedom. So to answer your question, we found courage not in spite of our circumstances, but because of them. We found it in each other. in the choice to see beyond the surface of things, in the decision to believe that mercy makes us human, and love makes us free. Choose love, dear friend. Choose it again and again, no matter what tries to stop you. Choose it for yourself, choose it for others, choose it for the world that so desperately needs it. In the end, it is the only choice that matters. Elena set down her pen and looked out the window at the desert that had nearly killed her, and had ultimately saved her. In the distance, she could see Thomas riding home from the far pasture, his silhouette strong against the setting sun. Soon he would be home, and they would sit by the fire as they had done for 25 years, two people who had found in each other the answer to every question that had ever mattered. Love transcends all boundaries. It transcends time and space and the categories that divide us. It transcends the worst things that happen to us and the best things we dare to hope for. It transcends slavery and freedom, grief and joy, silence and song. And in transcending these boundaries, it reveals the most profound truth of all, that we are not separate beings struggling alone in the darkness, but connected souls sharing the same light, the same hope, the same endless capacity for redemption. In the American West of 1882, in a small cabin in a valley between two mesas, two people proved that love is stronger than any force that seeks to destroy it. Their story became legend, their love became legacy, and their truth became the foundation upon which countless other stories of freedom would be built. The desert wind carried their laughter across the valley, and somewhere in the distance, another lost soul heard it and turned toward the sound of home.